what's going on there, just to give you a sense of comparison to some of that, and also why I think this is happening at the time that it's happening now. And not only there, but here, and of course in other places as well. Some of you know, I'm sure, that in Brazil in the last few days, the universities have in fact been invaded by police forces seeking to arrest or to punish dissident professors who Bolsonaro, the new president, thinks are a danger to his regime. So this is not just happening in Hungary; it's happening all around the globe. Again, even in countries where we don't think of authoritarians in charge. In France, a couple of days ago, Me Too protesters were attacked first by right-wing groups and then by the police as they were demonstrating. So we're dealing with a big international problem, of which this is one part. And people ask me to talk about what's going on in the United States. The one other point about these attacks on academic freedom is that gender is one of the targets of attack. Not so much right now in the United States in universities. Those are not, gender studies programs are not being shut down. But a couple of weeks ago, the Donald Trump administration announced that gender, for purposes of designating gender identity, only biological sex would be used. That all other forms of gender identification were illegitimate, unscientific, non-objective, and so on. So gender is a regular target of these groups. And as I say, gender studies not so much yet in the universities, but in the United States. But certainly the administration thinks that gender is one of the places where they can make points with their what they call their base, their followers. And I'll go into the reasons I think that's happening in a couple of minutes, but for now I just want to tell you a little bit about the scene in the United States, and then I want to just offer you what I think is some of the reasons that this is happening. And then we can open it up for questions and discussion. So the university is a place of critical inquiry, however we want to define it, and it's that is being attacked. It's the place that challenges prevailing beliefs. It's the place that traditionally issues all sorts of new forms of knowledge, but those new forms of knowledge upset traditional ways of thinking and certainly upset authoritarian rulers who don't want to be questioned in the positions and the programs that they're offering. In the United States, climate change is one of the issues, and climate scientists have been attacked, have been brought to court, their emails have been captured. The attempt is to show that they really don't know what they're talking about, that climate science is bogus science. Anti-abortion activists have been attacking those engaged in stem cell research. Stem cell research is very much on the line. Lobbyists for the state of Israel have demanded the dismissal of scholars in Middle Eastern studies. Middle Eastern studies are one of the targets in the United States for the most vicious kinds of attacks. And all manner of groups are charging that interdisciplinary programs in women's, gender, sexuality, race, and ethnic studies are modes of indoctrination, not education. So the line that's being offered is that
further than people who gave us a copy.
We could also get some people over on the sides there.
Well, somebody can come to next to you. That would be good.
Any takers?
The interesting thing in the States is that for the most part, although not entirely, the money is not coming from the state, or the support for these things, or the impetus is not coming from the state, but from right-wing individuals, foundations, and institutes. Here, it's the opposite, I guess, of the attack on the Soros Foundation has to do with its supporting academic freedom, supporting the CEU. From us, these it's the right-wing institutes, the Koch Foundation, the Heritage Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, the Amway Foundation, the Goldwater Institute. All of these places are funding to millions and millions of dollars, a concerted attack on universities. And they're doing it in a number of ways. They are supporting a movement on the right to use the notion of free speech and academic freedom as their weapon against us, against, I won't even say the left, against the universities, against liberal thinking in the universities. And they're doing that by sending speakers to speak on university campuses. None of them particularly academic. They're right-wing provocateurs. There's a guy named Milo Yiannopoulos. You probably know about some of this.
He was invited by the Hungarian government.
Well, it's exactly the same. He was invited by the Hungarian government. There, he's being invited by the college Republican clubs, whose way is being paid by the likes of the Koch and the Amway, these various private foundations. And the point is to have him give his talk, but that's not really the point. The point is to provoke the left into attacking him, to provoke us into going to his speeches and trying to shut him down. And then they can say that the universities, as there's one guy, Charlie Kirk, who is a founder of a group called Turning Point USA, then they can say that campuses are hotbeds of authoritarianism because they won't let an ordinary guy who wants to give a talk give his talk. So it's been a very difficult time figuring out on the part of student groups, of faculty groups, how to respond to this. Because if you fall into their trap, you then become the target of all the newspaper articles of the challenges. There are all sorts of stories about how students, snowflake students who can't tolerate difficult attacks on them or criticism, are demanding to shut down their campuses and their universities. So the strategy is a very well thought out strategy. It comes along not only with these invitations to these people to come and give their talks, but it also comes with legislation that's proposed, student bills of rights, which are meant to argue that students have complete right to say anything they want in a class, to talk about or to refuse to accept a professor's biological teaching, for example, and to insist that their view of creationism as the basis for biology is just as good as what the science the professor is teaching. So you have a kind of anti-intellectual turn that is being supported by these various foundations. And the election, this was going on before the election of Donald Trump, but the election of Donald Trump in the United States has just opened the gates for this to be happening. His Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is one of the founders of the Amway Foundation, which is supporting not only this attack on the university, but the privatization of most public schools. She goes around to university campuses giving speeches, and I'll quote from one of them. She's talking to a group of college students, and she says, "The fight against the education establishment belongs to you too. The faculty, from adjunct professor to deans, tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, what to think." This is the Secretary of Education calling upon students to fight against the education establishment. And we are the education establishment. Elite faculty who have nothing better to do than to indoctrinate our students into our ways of thinking. There's a testimony from one of the college young Republicans when they were passing legislation in Tennessee, these student bills of rights, and he says, "Students are often intimidated by the academic elite in the classroom." It's true, students are often intimidated by professors. But that's not what this is about. Tennessee is a conservative state. We will not allow out-of-touch professors with no real-world experience to intimidate 18-year-olds. This is the measure of what's being stirred up and talked about. And it keeps going on. There's a professor watch list now online by one of these groups where professors who are thought to be in any way left or critical, for example, of Israel's policies in Palestine or of the Trump administration, those professors are put up with pictures online, and this unleashes a world of internet harassment that is very hard to describe. People will receive, it'll go up on Breitbart and Fox News, our extreme right media, and then these faculty will start receiving death threats with pictures, Google Maps of where they live, the names of their children. The extent of the intimidation is very hard to describe, and the reluctance of university administrators to come forward and protect faculty is also very much an issue. In fact, many times these professors are punished as if they were the problem, rather than this right-wing attacks and provocation. There's this group, the Turning Point USA, whose head is Charlie Kirk, which defines itself, and this is a quote, as a youth organization that promotes the principles of fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. Their group has been given millions of dollars by these foundations, and they are training students to take secret videos and tape recordings of what goes on in the classroom. They then edit them to make them look as bad as possible, and they go up online, and then the professor becomes the target of these online attacks. It's very hard to describe the extent of it and the extent of intimidation that comes with it. So this happens to a professor in your university, and you start looking around at your students. You start being more careful about what you would say in class. You go for the less critical, more, I always think boring, and mundane ways of presenting your material because it's too dangerous to do it otherwise. There was a professor just last week at a small community college in California who teaches political theory, and Marx was one of what he taught in a long list of completely acceptable even to the right political theorists. And his lecture was taped and then doctored, so it looked like he was telling them they all had to become Marxists or communists and follow the Marxist line. He is now in hiding someplace because the threats were so dangerous. He and his family had to move out. He was removed from campus by the university security because they felt that his presence was causing a danger and a threat to the university. Meantime, the so-called student, if it was even a student who had been taping the stuff, remains free to continue the work that he already began. So we're talking about a climate of real danger and a sense of being under the gun, as it were. And in fact, I don't know how many of you know that there are many states in the United States where you can carry a concealed weapon on campus. It used to be that campuses were excluded. Now you can carry a concealed weapon on campus. So you're in a situation in which you're confronting a group of students who could be armed. And we know from just the last weeks in the United States that it takes only one armed student to kill off large numbers of people and create the kind of horrible situations that can follow. So the situation on campuses now are very dangerous. As I say, the state is less directly involved in the surveillance and punishment of supposed left-wing or critical faculty. But the election of Donald Trump has opened the door to the sense that this can be done with impunity, and his Secretary of Education is, of course, in the front ranks of those who are leading this attack. So the main thing I wanted to actually say today is that there's a reason that all of this is happening that has to do with more than authoritarian rulers coming into office. It's not. It certainly has something to do with that. And I think, just to go back for a minute to the issue of gender, gender is a target because for right-wing authoritarian rulers, gender is a good way of legitimizing their notion of power and inequality. The notion of traditional gender, that there are men and there are women biologically determined, and that nature or God, depending upon their religious beliefs, has decreed that, serves as a model, and has since the 18th century, as a model for the organization of nation states, in which inequalities are referred to nature, to gender and nature, and justified in that way, and then the gender system becomes naturalized by the use of it made by political authority. So that gender political connection, which in fact I'm going to talk about at some length tomorrow in the talk I have to give in the gender studies program, that serves a really important function for justifying authoritarian rule. And so it's no accident that gender is a source, or it is the target for these rulers. It's not just a side issue. It's not, in the United States, just the consolidation of his base that Trump is appealing to. It's a vision of the world in which men are superior to women, inequality is the name of the game, and inequality is the name of the game, and tradition is what's being protected by these authoritarian rulers. So gender is very tightly connected to what's going on. But I also think that what's going on is the transformation of the university that has begun in 20 or 30 years ago and is now in its fullest and most devolved form than it's been before. And that's where academic freedom and the transformation not only of the university but of values generally in society come into play. Because academic freedom depends for its definition, at least in any situation I know of it, on a special freedom granted to the university as the producer of knowledge for the common good, for our collective communal well-being. Those two things are tied together. The reason we have academic freedom, the reason professors are allowed to say what they want in a class, that students are pursuing what the research they're pursuing, granted a certain measure of freedom to do that, is because the knowledge that they produce is knowledge that will further the common good, that will critically open up new areas of thinking, that will invent things that had never been thought of before, that will reinterpret history in ways that will give us a better sense of why things are the way they are now. That without the common good, without a belief that the production of knowledge is a critical activity that produces, that advances the welfare of our societies, without that you don't have academic freedom. And that notion of the common good is what has been undermined by what we all are calling neoliberalism over the last 20 or 30 years. So it's that transformation, that notion of the common good as the university's unique contribution that has been undermined over the past years. And Donald Trump, Viktor Orbán, Bolsonaro, those guys are just the latest and most dangerous threat to it. They can take advantage of a situation which has been steadily deteriorating over the years. So, and that I'll just read you a couple of sentences because I can do it more clearly and in a more concise way. So this transformation, at least in the United States, has taken place under Democratic and Republican administrations at the national and at the state levels, And it's as much, as I say, an effect of the development of neoliberal capitalism as it is of party politics. So we're not talking about parties now, or even left and right. We're talking about a more general process of transformation. In the realm of higher education, it has involved dramatically decreased public funding for colleges and universities, and that's true whether we have private or public situations. Greater reliance on student tuition, and in the United States, a really dramatic increase in student debt. Greater need for private support, for philanthropic support, accompanied by an increased intervention in academic decision-making by wealthy donors and other entities taking the place of state support. The substitution of contingent employees for permanent tenured faculty. In the United States now, only 30-some% of the faculty are tenured or tenure-track. That is, are in permanently guaranteed position. 75% of faculty are what are called contingent faculty on year-to-year contracts of one kind or another. A widening gap between richer and poorer institutions, one that parallels the widening gap between rich and poor in the population at large. The introduction of corporate management styles by academic administrators and boards of trustees, and a consequent decline of faculty participation in university government. I mean, this is, for you guys, this is Bologna, I think, in some way or another, or in the UK, it's the research assessment that measures everything in terms of quantities of numbers of pages and quantities of hours spent teaching. The substitution by university administrators of calculations of risk for evaluations of the quality of ideas. So when these demonstrations happen, the risk factor is now brought into to play, and the lawyers come in and decide how to deal with the situation rather than having faculty respond in terms of the values and principles of education. And measuring the value of a university education exclusively in economic terms as the enhancement of a student's human capital instead of their cultural and intellectual resources. There, Wendy Brown, whose book you may know, what is it, something, the demos, Undoing the Demos, thank you. She talks about, she has all these citations from university presidents' speeches at commencement, at graduation, in which they say, you're leaving here with more human capital than what you came with. And you know, you think of what graduation speeches are often like, it's not usually like that. So there's a kind of been an instrumentalization of knowledge, and it's accompanied by a heightened ideology of individualism and a concomitant practice of privatization, and those have replaced the notion of the common good, the belief on which that covenant between the university and the public good, between academic freedom and the public good, rested, and a belief that recognized academic freedom as an essential ingredient of that. So for us, in fact, too, the attack on taxes is part of that. Taxes are one's contribution to the common good, to the common welfare. I mean, I pay taxes knowing that it will support things that don't benefit me directly, but that are a contribution to the common good. The attack on taxes as something the government is taking away from you is part of this transformation of the notion of the common good, the collective well-being, into an issue of the individual's relationship to the state. So all of that, it seems to me, is part of what we're facing in this moment of, we might want to call it, certainly it's a crisis for the university. It's a crisis for academic freedom. It's a crisis for those of us whose principles are committed to critical thought and critical thinking. And the question is what to do in the face of it. And there are examples, and yours is one of them, of what, in fact, it seems to me we have to do to try to preserve something of what is left of a tradition of university teaching, of critical thinking in the university, and also using our teaching in some way to produce some notion of the collective well-being and of the common good. there's a kind of connection. If we want to preserve academic freedom, we have to think about how what we're doing contributes to a notion of our being part of a collective, rather than individuals pulling out whatever it is we can from the system. In the United States, there are all sorts of groups like this, although not doing exactly the same things, trying to do this. There's an effort to unionize faculty and graduate students, which is succeeding against all odds. There's one really interesting story about this. The graduate students at Columbia University have been trying to unionize for a long time. The provost of that university is a man named John Coatsworth, who, when I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, was the leader of the protests against the war in Vietnam and a member of the Progressive Labor Party, whose motto was "Students and Workers Unite," and who was the biggest opponent of graduate student university unionization that there was. Columbia has just conceded, after several years of graduate student strikes. The latest strike threat was more than they could take, and they conceded, and they will now negotiate for a union. So there's a unionization effort going on. But I remember I actually sent an email to John Coatsworth, whom I knew quite well, and I said, "What's going on? You used to be for students, you used to say that students and workers were the same thing." I got no answer. You would expect from that. So they're unionizing, there's student protests, there are books and articles, studies by there are educational associations of all kinds. I'm part of a group, the American Association of University Professors, which is constantly producing reports, looking to do investigations at universities who are unfairly punishing professors who are the targets of attacks rather than the cause of attacks, and so on. And things like what you are doing here contribute to that movement, which I think is an international movement, despite the fact that it's often covered only locally. And we need to kind of take seriously the fact that there's something that's being lost if this attack continues. If they are allowed to take away education as the source of social and intellectual and political renewal, then we're really all, I won't say the word, but we're really all done in by the powers of the authoritarian powers who are right now trying to contain and control and do away with the criticism we represent. So I want to thank you for doing this, and I will go home and report what I've seen, and we'll try to make this into something more of an international conversation than it has been so far, and in numbers, in union, there is strength. So thank you. Let's hear what you have to say, what I can answer.
Can I make two comments?
Yes, it's fine.
First, that we should understand that academic freedom is more restricted than freedom of speech, freedom of expression,
yes,
freedom of thought, guaranteed to citizens to a democratic country under the rule of law. You can be a fool outside the university, but if you apply to a position at an astrophysics department with a flat earth theory, can accept a few religious universities in Hungary, you would not get the job. You cannot write anything for a peer-reviewed journal because your peers would not let the article be published. So freedom inside the university is more restricted than outside the walls of a university under a constitutional democracy, not here in Hungary. Now, let me make a comparison between the situation in the US and the situation here. Anti-intellectualism has a long history in the US, going back to the 17th century. And in 1963, Richard Hofstadter the sociologist and public intellectual, published a famous book, Anti-Intellectualism in America, in which he argued that this long tradition of anti-intellectualism goes back to the opposition between the Protestant ethos of the Midwest, the practical people who are able to solve their problems with their own hands, on the one hand, and on the other side, the Eastern intellectuals on the East Coast of the US. Now, this is not the situation here in Hungary. The opposition is not between knowing what and knowing how, the practical common sense of the people in the countryside as opposed to the university elite. The words, the prime minister who occupies the parliament while we occupy Kossuth here, uses words like cunning, how to outfox others, how to fool others, how to do things without any consequences. This is what the regime and the Prime Minister stands for. There was an article published the day before the election in April in which the author, a very proud racist, a close friend of the Prime Minister, compared the Western way, that is Michael Kohlhaas from Kleist's drama. Kohlhaas's tragedy is that when he experiences injustice, he thinks that justice, the law, will be able to solve the problem. This is the old Western way. But the Eastern way, our way, is the way how our folk hero, Matty the Goose Boy, tried to solve his problem. When the landlord took his keys, then he decided to take vengeance, and ambushing the Lord managed to beat him 3 times. We Hungarians wrote this body of the Prime Minister rarely, only rarely. But we take things in our hands and we don't fool ourselves that the law or the university or these intellectuals will solve our problems. We solve our problems ourselves. So I think that the situation here is slightly different from the situation.
Yes and no, I think. The first point, I think you're absolutely right, and if I had a sense of more time, I would have talked about that. The distinction between free speech and academic freedom. Academic freedom is a privilege granted to those who have credentialed themselves as serious scholars. And there are all sorts of problems with that in terms of disciplinary orthodoxies and limits, but academic freedom is the special guarantee to faculty who are credentialed for the teaching that they do to have the right of freedom in the classroom and freedom of expression and of teaching. But you know, the individual solving their own problems, that's something that Trump is now appealing to. The notion that he is the chief, he's the individual in chief. He is no longer, and this is a lot like the guy that you're citing, I think. We'll solve our own problems. We don't need, what he wants is courts that will act on his behalf, and he denounces the system, the notion of an objective judiciary to limit the powers of the president and the legislature in the name of his individual will needing to prevail, and they'll find ways to make that happen. So I think there are nuances of difference, but the striking thing is that this notion of individualism as the solution to the problem, and these guys as the individual in chief. I mean, the great irony is that they are presenting themselves as the great fathers. I think of this in Freudian terms as the primal father. The primal father gets to sleep with all the women, gets to make all the laws but break all the laws, is the incarnation of a certain kind of superpower that if you just listen to him, he'll take care of you. On the other hand, they're invoking all of your individualisms as what it is they're freeing up. So there is something in common in this recourse to individualism. We do it with guns. You guys do it with your fists. but there are, I think there are similarities as well as differences that are being invoked. Yeah.
It's just a quick note. If you read Totem Taboo, the private father ends rather sadly and violently, so that might be a note.
Well, he does and he doesn't, because he ends rather sadly.
But gets.
But that is the sons kill him and eat him, but then they all look to become him. Each of them, I mean, they're brothers, but each of them knows that he's really the father. Lacan calls it the phallic exception, right? Each of them knows that he ate more of the father than the rest of them, and he can become the father. That's how I think about some of these guys now. They are the restored primal father. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. And to me, it sounds very familiar. I'm from Russia. About superfather and about political pressure in the academia and the institutions. You don't need to be a leftist in the Russian academia to be evicted from the academia or from anywhere. You just have to be like non-normative in political way.
Exactly.
Or a lesbian, for example. Yeah, this is also so true. But I wanted to ask you about, like you said several times the word that is preservation. But what I wanted to put attention to that you were saying that it's exactly the system, it's not about the parties, that is problematic. So how it works together, the preservation and the system, because you were saying about the preservation of academic freedom. Maybe there are other ways of, building new solidarities, but not preserving, but maybe creating something new.
Well, I think both are necessary. Actually, I always thought of myself as somebody who wanted to change everything. And now I find myself in the position of a conservative. That is, there are certain values and principles that are really, I think, crucially important and that we can't do without.
You mean democratic?
Democratic principles, yeah. And that have to do with, academic freedom is not an entirely democratic principle, as Ishan Rev points out. It's one in which a certain authority is granted to faculty in relation to students and in relation to the administration of universities. But it seems to me there's a reason to want to hold on to some of that. So there are democratic principles of participation in a voice in the governance of one's society. Those things seem to me tremendously important. At the same time, I think we need to think about other ways of organizing states, other ways of being represented that don't depend on political parties to represent us, other ways that might be thought of understanding our what society's relationships actually are. I mean, those are big abstract notions, but I think there's room to think in terms of some of the principles that we want to preserve are in fact open-ended principles. They're abstractions. They're not, there's no definition set in the dictionary that can never be changed. So it seems to me one of the things is to work with those principles in the name of a set of ethical commitments that we have and seek to realize them in ways that are different from the ways they've been realized before. That's my best bet at it. But I do think that, notions like equality, justice, you don't want to give up on those. You just don't want to take them as they've always been defined. But any language, it seems to me, any set of principles are always abstraction, aspirational abstractions. And how they will be fulfilled is up to us to try to argue and figure out.
I think you want, and then, yeah, go ahead.
I'm from JNU and we are fighting very much the same struggle. So
JU is
JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi.
yes.
So we've been fighting the same struggle for 2 years and we have cut it day by day. and the mode of operation is usually to send circulars with new rules, undercutting the statutes of our university. Our method is existentialist. We don't give in, we remain where we are, and we continue our battle. Expecting, of course, the elections in May will change things for us, which it may not.
Yeah.
But our way of communicating is that of satyagraha. 7,000 students, 600 teachers, of which 250 may be right-wing, supporting the administration. Nevertheless, the remaining are always visible, and they continue to take their classes. The students come to the class, PhD dissertations are completed. All the work that we did earlier, we continue to do. So there's no way in which administration can actually shut down the work. So the ability that teachers have is really the coexistence of time. We live in so many different worlds simultaneously. I'm here last 2 months, and I will leave on the 11th of December, knowing that things have got much worse in JNU. So last night, the teachers were out in the cold. They had a satyagraha where the lights in administration were switched off. They were not given any kind of facilitation. They had brought their quilts and mattresses, of course. But one can imagine in Delhi, it would be maybe 6 degrees or 7 degrees cold. So they are willing to put corporate bodies to the test. And I think it's going to increase. And it is frightening, especially for the older generation. But what we see is the value that 7,000 students put to education. And that is the most amazing thing. They're there all the time, and they bring to us a sense of their fervor, and they make it very clear that they will not let the universities close down. And I think there is support from other universities on a daily basis as well. The RSS, which is always carrying its sticks, they're called lathis, they come into the campus. The security has now received, greater support. The administration has cut down the education grant to 10% and put the rest of money into security. The security are basically villagers from hinterland spaces where they bring their faith, which is a traumatic space for them as well, because the notion of good and right as we understand it in human rights discourse just goes away. So it's you and us, or you or us. So the space which is set up in terms of this immensely religious language of fundamentalism is what these 7,000 students have to work with.
And I hope, if there are ways in your being here, you can continue the networking and the connection between what's going on here and what's going on there. It seems to me really important for us to know that elsewhere similar sorts of things are going on, because it gives a stronger sense of connection and of purpose to these activities.
Well, I think state authority is such, legal or illegal as it may be, essentially just gain power. It really means that one can take it only day by day. One does not know what the future is, one does not know who will survive, who will not, and even those who leave will continue the work that they do as intellectuals wherever they are, and I think that is what is most interesting in this.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that we haven't mentioned Turkey yet.
Yes.
And that's an important place as well. There are several hands. And then you. Yeah?
Hello. First of all, thank you for your lecture. I really appreciate it. I was raised in California, and I've actually taught here in Hungary for 2 years at a secondary school. And I've noticed a similarity between the two of them, in that there is this pretension of teaching sociology through social studies, but it's really not actually taught. And I am also interested in the sort of, more populist upsurge inside of universities, where you have professors attacking their teachers, Turning Point USA, for example. And I'm curious if there's a connection between these two, because I've always seen sociology as being in the position of being able to challenge or at least relativize some contemporary values that society has, and sort of being between values. So I'm curious your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, sociology and political science both have been transformed dramatically. There are pockets at Berkeley, for example, where sociology continues to do what you're describing. But overall, sociology has become a more normative, I almost said religion, a more normative study of things. Data becomes, collecting data and analyzing data, and evidence-based argument becomes more and more the way things have to be done. So it's not surprising that the disciplines are, some of the disciplines are transformed by some of this neoliberal, which is to put it in its big context, transformation. So that goes back to the question about transformation and keeping things and transforming them. Obviously, we don't want to keep or letting disciplines fall into line in terms of the neoliberal transformation of the university is not the way to go. That's not what we want to preserve. The question is how to promote critical thinking and critical study at the same time that we hold on to notions of democracy and free speech.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. And
You have to talk louder.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
You have to yell.
Everyone can hear?
No, you have to yell.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. I'm from Brazil and you mentioned a lot Bolsonaro. So I want to ask you a question because it's kind of paradoxical for me. The whole question that we take the American university system as the example to follow when it comes mostly about private investments in universities. So what happened this year with our biggest museum, the whole country that caught fire? The government said, oh, it was not our fault, the fault was the university. They said no for a private investor that wanted to put money on the museum. So I just really want to understand like why we still think that the U.S. American system is the best to follow, and what are the consequences of that? For example, we lost our biggest museum, and I don't think we're going to get back anything from that.
No.
And yes.
And archives, you know, from the historian sort of point of view, archives that will never be replaced, valuable collections that will never be replaced. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for CEU, the American model was, and I think that the Open Society Foundation vision was a post-communist democratic institution that would come to this region, and that would be a place where a different kind of educational system from one that was thought to be indoctrinating its students would be established. In that sense, I mean, I think that's the origin of it. The model is, in some ways, a phantasmatic model, given what I've been describing to you about American universities, and given even what's been going on for the last 20 or 30 years in the United States, the undermining of not only the public universities and increasingly privatizing them, but the privatizing as an instrument now of donors and trustees to reshape the university in the ways in which they wanted to. Before, the grand old private universities, the trustees of those universities understood that they were funding something for the public good, and they left it alone, more or less. That has changed dramatically in the last years, so that there's a kind of corporate management now that runs those universities, surrounded by lawyers talking about risk and vulnerability to lawsuits, surrounded by people attempting to measure the impact and the outcome of an education. The Obama administration wanted to introduce a measure of standing for universities, which would rate universities on the basis of how many students got jobs immediately after graduation. That was the Obama administration. And so this vision, this fantasy of what the American university represented is no longer the case. I mean, it may be a situation in which fantasy is a good thing to hold on to, but the reality of the situation is what I've been describing and what you've been experiencing in different ways here as well. That's all I could say.
One last question. You have a question? Yes, and then
individualism, apathy, disenfranchisement.
franchise of this holy triumvirate of threats to democracy are running rampant, particularly amongst young people these days. An inordinate number of people back home in the UK and here in Hungary have asked me, why are you protesting? What's the point? It's not going to change the government, it won't change your policy, it won't change legislation. And my answer to that is always, you're placing your expectation in the wrong place. It's like prayer for those who are religious. You don't pray to God because it changes God, you pray because it changes you. And for me, protest is exactly the same. It's about finding a local of energy. It's about forming connection. It's about solidarity and realising that all of these issues, individual though they may seem, form part of a greater whole. And I can convey that message and I can do it reasonably eloquently. But maybe somebody who's got more experience in this, who is more invested in it even, would you have a message for us to hear?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to your point about existentialism, right? If you had asked me 30 years ago if existentialism would be my position claim, I probably would have said no. But it seems to me that now we're in a situation in which we've lost a belief that the future will redeem us, that history will redeem us. There's no sense now that we are guaranteed a better future. The lectures that I've been giving at the university are really about this. The judgment of history is always invoked as something that will, in the end, validate us, and it's what we're reaching toward. I think we're seeing that history can repeat itself. That there's no redemption in history itself, whatever that is. So I think we are in a position in which the question of taking action and resisting things that are being taken away from us is something we have to do. And the action is consequential, even if it isn't guaranteed to be transformative. So I think that's my message. There is no alternative but to act. And sometimes we get things as a result of that. I mean, if you do the history of protest movements, they are not without hope. They are not without consequence. And so it's the consequential nature of our action that we have to be looking towards. And there's no other choice. Thank you.
Okay.
You guys are out here in the cold day after day.